One is the question of the so-called golden age of the Islamic world, with particular
Yes,
reference to
Islam.
mathematics,
yes,
which will make people think, okay, science arises in the Christian West, but we also have this rich tradition of
we
science and
do.
discovery
That's
within Islam
absolutely
as
right.
well.
That's funny because yeah, I just mentioned that in Islam you do have the idea of one creator. You have the idea of one creator who creates everything. So why didn't Muslims come up with a scientific revolution? They had scientific advancements and so on, but it was like in engineering, coming up how to make stuff, and in medicine, so how to keep your soldiers healthy and so on after battles. But why didn't Muslims come up with scientific revolution? Well, they had the idea of a creator. They didn't have the idea of human beings created in the image of God and kind of made to figure these things out. In Islam, you're ignorant unless Allah tells you something. You don't get this idea that you're supposed to go and figure things out. You're supposed to sit there and let Allah tell you things. And guess what? That's not a good recipe. That's not a good recipe for figuring out the universe. And so even when you have these brief spurts of science or philosophy and so on in Islam, they never last. They don't last. Islam suffocates it. And you never get anything like a scientific revolution. Yeah, I just mentioned that. But yeah, Alex, why doesn't it last? Why doesn't it last? Islam expands and Islam encounters writings of people who came before, and Muslims would take off with this for a while and they'd learn. And then it just wouldn't last at all. So what's going on there?
And the extent
I'm saying that because I don't know what I know. John Lennox is a master of various fields. I don't know how much he knows about the history of Islam. So I guess we're about to find out.
I wondered if you had a view on whether Islam can be similarly credited with
I
scientific
think
knowledge.
I'm not an expert at Islam, but I used to be very interested in what went on in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, where a lot of work was done, and some of it by Christians, by the way, working away at translating some of the more ancient classical documents into languages that were available to people around. And at the very least, in the Islamic tradition, you have a very strong transmission of more ancient texts. That, of course, helped with the advance of modern science. But as far as I know, not a great deal of innovation. But I'd put, again, I would say my field is algebra, and the word algebra comes from al-jabr, which is an Arabic word. And in the Islamic world, you had tremendous understanding of observational astronomy and their ways of solving equations and so on, and back into the Babylonian world. So we had certainly a great deal of stuff that was transmitted forward and helped. I would say helped enormously. But in the sort of innovation and experimentation and all this kind of thing, and the vast steps forward taken by people like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, they didn't get that far, but we must credit them.
Yeah, so that was interesting. So he points out that Islamic civilization inherited a bunch of stuff, both because it was already there, because the Babylonians did a bunch of stuff, but also because as they're expanding and conquering, they're taking over. Basically, when you conquer an area, you also get their writings and whatever writings and so on that they have. And so they inherited a lot of it. And these, to be clear, these things would take off for a while. And what would happen, we actually know, what would happen is you'd get some new books in, like, let's say, philosophy. You get to an area, you conquer an area, you've got some books in philosophy. Muslims would have to go, some group of Muslims would have to go to the caliph and say, hey, can we explore these texts and these teachings and so on and see of what benefit they will ultimately be to Islam? And they'd have to get permission from the caliph. And then they could go explore these texts. And what would happen is you'd get a brief period where philosophy takes off in the Muslim world. And eventually they would realize, oh, this isn't working well with Islam. And so it has to go. And Islam would just suffocate it. You'd end up with a tension between the scholars of the Quran and the scholars who are examining the world. You actually have this. If you look at Tafsir Jalalain, when he's talking about the earth being flat, says, hey, it says right here in the Quran, the earth is flat. And so it's not, as the astronomers have it, a sphere. And so he actually breaks down this conflict. He's saying, hey, the Muslim scholars, we know the earth is flat, but the scientists tell us that the earth is a sphere. And so you end up with these kinds of conflicts. And guess what? You don't want to be a scientist and be in conflict with the religious leaders in an area. So this stuff would never last. So you can't have things taking off it doesn't last.